Men do not always know what they really need until life sets before them what they have never asked for. The sun was cutting across the horizon like a glowing blade when Thomas Brennan spotted the cloud of dust in the distance. He sat on the porch of his modest home, a glass of warm water resting on his right knee, watching the road winding between the dry hills. 3 weeks had passed since she sent the letter to Denver, responding to the ad in the newspaper. 3 weeks imagining what she would be like. Delicate, silent, the kind that would need protection from the harsh winds of those lands. The property he had built with his own hands stretched modestly through the valleys, well-made fences bordering pastures where cattle grazed under the scant shade of gnarled trees. He was a man who worked from before dawn until after dark, but loneliness weighed more than any physical burden. At 42, Thomas had calloused hands and a heart still whole, kept like gold in a locked safe. The cart approached slowly, swaying on the stones of the path. Thomas stood up, smoothed the clean shirt he had put on for the occasion, and descended the 3 wooden steps that creaked under his weight. The coachman, a thin man with a collapsed hat, waved from afar before stopping the horses near the gate. He shouted Brennan's name across the distance, confirmed the delivery he had brought from Denver. Thomas walked to the wagon, his heart beating faster than he would like to admit. He expected to see a small figure, perhaps bent over by the long journey, someone who needed his help to get down. What he saw was a pair of leather boots that touched the ground before he even got close. Large, solid boots, followed by long legs wrapped in a thick fabric skirt. When she turned to face him, Thomas had to tilt his head up. The woman was taller than him by at least 3 fingers, had broad shoulders, and hands that seemed to know heavy work. Her brown hair was tied up in a practical way, a few loose strands dancing in the wind, and her blue eyes studied it with the same curiosity with which he watched her. Catherine Walsh held out her right hand without hesitation, introduced herself in a clear voice that cut through the hot air. He squeezed her hand and felt calluses on her fingertips, a firm grip that matched her bearing. For a moment they stood there measuring themselves like 2 animals that meet for the first time in neutral territory. The coachman unloaded his luggage, 2 shabby leather suitcases and a wooden box, and said goodbye in a hurry, as if he sensed that this moment needed privacy. Thomas commented on the long trip, searching for words that seemed to have escaped his mind. Catherine responded with economy, mentioning 3 days on the road, a lot of dry ground and little greenery. His voice had a practical quality, without ornament or unnecessary complaints. Catherine looked around, surveying the property with practical eyes. His posture was upright, unhurried, like someone used to evaluating situations before making decisions. He showed no tiredness or discomfort, just calculated attention that made Thomas feel watched and judged. He walked to the nearest fence and tested the firmness of the wood with light hand pressure. She remarked aloud that the lands were larger than she had imagined. Thomas explained that he had been working on them for 15 years, every post, every fence, built with his own hands. Catherine just nodded, a simple acknowledgement that was neither approval nor disapproval, just the record of a fact. There was something about her posture that Thomas couldn't decipher. Catherine moved around the property as if she were cataloguing every detail, every need, every possibility. Her strides were long and decisive, and Thomas found himself walking faster to keep up with her. She examined everything with the eyes of someone who understood hard work and land that needs to be tamed. The wind blew harder, kicking up dust and making their clothes flutter. Catherine did not shrink or shield her face as most women would. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment and breathed deeply, as if he were tasting the air of this place, testing whether he could call it home. She stopped walking and declared with simplicity that he had expected someone different. It wasn't a question, and Thomas didn't try to deny it. Honesty had always been his moral compass, even when it hurt. He admitted that he had imagined someone who needed more care, more protection from the harshness of that world. Catherine turned to him, her blue eyes with an intensity that made him retreat half a step. He observed that he was waiting for someone to hide behind his decisions, who would ask permission to breathe. Thomas tried to deny it, but she cut off his words before they left, saying she didn't need to hear confirmation to know the truth. They were silent for a while, the wind filling the space between them with whispers and groans that came from the distant hills. Thomas felt that he was facing a moment that would define not only that day, but possibly the rest of his life. Catherine Walsh wasn't what he had asked for, but maybe it was just what he needed, even if he didn't know it yet. The sun began to tilt westward, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. The shadows stretched over the dry land, and Thomas realized they needed to make a decision. She had traveled 3 days to get there. He couldn't just send her away because she didn't live up to his expectations. Thomas mentioned that the house had 2 bedrooms, which she could use the smaller one until they decided how things would go between them. Catherine nodded once, an economic move that revealed neither relief nor gratitude, only practical acceptance of the situation that presented itself. She headed for where her baggage awaited, moving with that natural confidence that Thomas observed with increasing fascination. For the first time in weeks, he didn't know exactly what he was praying for. The woman who had stepped out of the wagon was not the delicate answer he had asked for, but perhaps it was the question he had never been able to ask. The first night brought with it all the noises that a house not accustomed to 2 people produces, the creaking of planks under unknown steps, the opening and closing of doors at a different pace, the heavy silence of 2 presences that did not yet know how to occupy the same space. Thomas remained awake long after hearing Catherine settle into the smaller room. Lying on his bed, he watched the shadows that the moon cast on the ceiling through the curtainless window. He had prepared a simple dinner, bread, jerky, and baked beans, which they ate in respectful silence, each measuring the other by furtive glances over the rustic wooden table. Catherine ate with a practical appetite, without excessive delicacy or haste. His hands handled utensils efficiently, cut meat with precise movements, chewed slowly like someone who had learned not to waste food. He did not comment on the taste or ask for additional seasonings. He simply consumed what was offered, with the same practical acceptance that he had shown when examining the property. When she finished, Catherine got up and began to collect the dishes without asking permission or waiting for instructions. Thomas tried to protest, gesticulating that it was not necessary, but she simply continued her task with quiet determination. He cleaned the table, washed the utensils in the basin of water that he kept near the stove, dried everything with economical and organized movements. Throughout the process, Thomas watched his hands work. They were larger than those of most women he had met, with calluses on their palms and small scars on their fingers that spoke of years of rough labor. They were not hands that asked for protection. They were hands that offered competence. Dawn arrived with its familiar ritual of colors that bled on the horizon, turning the sky from black to purple, then orange, finally the pale blue that heralded another day of unrelenting heat. Thomas dressed as he always did, thick leather trousers, faded cotton shirt, boots that knew every stone on his property. When she left for her morning work, checking on the cattle, repairing a fence that had been damaged by the wind the previous week, fetching water from the well, she found Catherine already awake. She was in the kitchen, had brewed coffee in her iron coffee pot, and cut slices of the bread left over from dinner. He didn't say good morning or ask how he had slept. He just pushed a steaming cup towards him and started eating his own meal. Thomas accepted the coffee and found that she had brewed it strong, the way she liked it but had never mentioned it. Maybe it was just coincidence, or maybe Catherine was the kind of person who observed details without having to ask. He ate the bread in silence, sipping coffee that tasted slightly different, better than what he used to brew for himself. When he got up to leave, Catherine asked him a simple question about what he planned to do during the day. Thomas explained about the damaged fence, the cattle that needed to be moved to a pasture with better pasture, the pit pump that was making a strange noise. Catherine just nodded, absorbing the information without offering any help or showing any particular interest. Thomas went about his errands hoping to find her in the house when he returned, perhaps reading a book or sewing some garment. What he found 3 hours later was Catherine in the south pasture, watching the cattle with focused attention. She had exchanged her skirt for men's pants that should have been in her luggage and wore a wide hat that protected her face from the already strong morning sun. He approached her slowly, as he would any animal he didn't want to frighten. Catherine heard him coming but didn't turn around, keeping her eyes fixed on the cows grazing near a small pond formed by the previous week's rain. She commented that some of the cows appeared to be limping from their right hind legs. Thomas looked in the direction she indicated and confirmed that 3 animals had symptoms that he had noticed but had not yet had time to investigate. Catherine suggested that it could be an infection caused by the stagnant water of the dam, something common in regions where cattle drink from contaminated sources. The observation demonstrated knowledge that Thomas did not expect. She asked where she had learned about cattle, and Catherine replied that she had grown up on a ranch in Colorado, had worked with animals since she was a child. Her father raised cattle and horses, and she learned to recognize diseases even before she could read properly. Thomas felt something move in his chest, a mixture of surprise and something that could be relief. Catherine was not just a tall, strong woman. He was someone who understood the life he lived, the challenges he faced daily. Perhaps he did not need to protect her from the difficulties of living in those lands. Maybe she could help him face them. They spent the morning walking around the property together. Catherine asked practical questions about pasture rotation, water quality, predators that threatened the herd. His questions revealed real experience, not superficial curiosity. Thomas found himself responding with details he had never shared with anyone, explaining decisions he had made on his own for so many years. When the sun reached the highest point in the sky, they returned to the house. Catherine prepared a simple but substantial lunch, using spices she found in her pantry, in ways that significantly improved the taste of the food. They ate again in silence, but this time the silence had a different quality, less tense, more contemplative. After lunch, Thomas resumed his duties. Catherine disappeared for a few hours, and he assumed he was resting or organizing his things in the room. When she saw her again in the late afternoon, she was fixing a hole in the kitchen window screen, using needle and thread with precise and efficient movements. He did not ask permission to make the repair, nor did he mention that he had noticed the problem. He simply saw something that needed to be corrected, and took the initiative to correct it. Thomas watched his hands work. The same fingers that had brewed coffee in the morning now handled the needle with the dexterity of someone accustomed to solving practical problems. In the evening, they prepared dinner together for the first time. Catherine naturally took on certain tasks while Thomas took care of others, as if they had already developed a routine through some quiet understanding. She seasoned the meat while he prepared the vegetables. He served the food while she set the table. During the meal, Thomas began to notice small details about Catherine that he had lost on their first date. The way she listened when he spoke, giving her complete attention without interrupting. How his eyes moved around the house, always observing, always evaluating, but without apparent criticism. How she moved with economy of gestures, without haste but without wasting time. After dinner, she again insisted on cleaning everything herself. This time, Thomas did not protest. Instead, he sat by the window and watched her work. There was something almost meditative about the way Catherine performed household chores, fluid movements, focused attention, a quiet satisfaction in getting things in order. When she finished, Catherine said goodbye with a simple nod of her head and retired to her room. Thomas stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the nightly sounds of the desert, wind in the trees, distant coyotes, the creaking of the wood in the house cooling after the heat of the day. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone in his own home. There was something changing between them, something subtle but undeniable. Catherine Walsh wasn't the frail companion he'd imagined, but perhaps she was something better. A partner who could share not just his bed, but his job, his responsibilities, his hard-built life in those hard lands. The first summer storm arrived in the third week, heralding itself with dark clouds that gathered on the western horizon like a black wall against the late afternoon yellow sky. The wind changed direction, brought with it the smell of rain that was still miles away, and made the horses in the pasture flutter with instinctive nervousness. Thomas was repairing the pit pump when he felt the first cold blasts against his face. He looked up at the sky and saw that there was perhaps an hour before the storm arrived, in all its fury. He needed to collect the cattle from the north pasture, close the gates, check that the windows of the house were well fastened. It was a job for two people, but he had always done it alone. Catherine appeared by his side before he even finished evaluating everything he needed to do. She had changed her clothes, now wore thick leather pants, tall boots, and a cotton shirt that could belong to any rural worker. He held in his hands a coiled rope and a wide-brimmed hat that protected his eyes from the rising wind. Without waiting for explanation, Catherine pointed to the northern pasture and made a practical observation about the weather they had before the rain came. Thomas nodded and quickly explained what needed to be done. Separate the cattle into two groups, move the younger animals to the stable, leave the others in the southernmost pasture that had better drainage. Catherine listened to the instructions with focused attention, asked a few specific questions about which animals to prioritize, then headed to the stable without hesitation. When she returned, she was riding a black mare that Thomas rarely used, controlling the animal as naturally as she walked on dry land. They worked together for the next 40 minutes in a sync that surprised Thomas. Catherine knew about cattle. knew how to move them without causing panic, positioned herself in the right places to guide the animals in the desired direction. His actions were precise, economical, effective. He did not constantly ask what to do, nor did he expect approval for each move. When the first raindrops began to fall, thick and spaced out, the cattle were safe and they ran back to the house. Catherine dismounted near the stable, nursed her mare with quick but careful movements, then followed Thomas toward the house through the rain that was now falling with increasing intensity. They arrived soaking wet on the balcony, breathing heavily from the effort and the race against time. Catherine removed her hat and shook off the water, her loose hair clinging to her face, drops running down her neck. Thomas observed how comfortable she seemed, even wet and tired, as if storms were just another aspect of life that needed to be faced with practicality. Inside the house, Catherine went directly to her room to change clothes, while Thomas lit the fire in the fireplace. The wind howled around the house, made the windows flicker in their frames, and the rain drummed on the roof with a force that increased by the minute. It was the kind of storm that could last all night, completely isolating the property from the rest of the world. When Catherine returned, wearing a dry skirt and a simple blouse, she found Thomas brewing strong coffee and heating up leftovers from the previous night's dinner. She naturally took on some tasks, lit an additional lamp when the darkness became thicker, closed a window that was letting in rain splashes. They ate by the fire, listening to the storm strike the house with increasing fury. The wind moaned between the planks of the walls. The rain hammered the roof with an intensity that made any conversation difficult. But the silence between them was not uncomfortable. There was something comforting about sharing that hot, dry space, while nature demonstrated its strength outside. Thomas watched Catherine by the firelight. The flames painted her face with shades of gold and red, creating shadows that changed each time she moved. Her eyes reflected the light of the fire, and for the first time since she had arrived, Thomas saw her not only as the woman who didn't live up to his expectations, but as Catherine Walsh, a complete person with her own story, her own fears, and her own strength. During a moment of calm in the storm, Catherine remarked that she had enjoyed working with the cattle. His voice had a different quality, softer, less guarded. Thomas asked about his life in Colorado, about the ranch where he had grown up, about how he had learned to ride and manage animals. Catherine spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. She told her about her father, a tough but fair man who had treated her more like a son than a daughter when he realized that she had an aptitude for rural work. About her mother, who had died when Catherine was 15, leaving her as the only woman in a house full of rough men. About how he had learned to be strong because there was no alternative. How he had developed competence because it was his only way to gain respect. Thomas listened without interrupting, beginning to understand where Catherine's natural confidence came from, her direct way of dealing with situations. She hadn't chosen to be strong, she had been forced to develop strength. I hadn't learned to be independent out of preference. I had learned because I depended on it to survive. When she finished speaking, they were silent for a while. The storm continued outside, but inside the house was a new intimacy, built not through romantic words or courtship gestures, but through the sharing of hard work and true stories. Thomas began to talk about his own life, about how he had arrived in these lands 15 years earlier, with only a horse and enough tools to get started. About the first brutal winters, the summers that almost killed him with heat, the years of building everything himself because there was no one he could completely trust. Catherine listened with the same attention he had given to her story. He asked occasional questions, always practical, always showing that he understood the difficulties he described. When Thomas mentioned the loneliness of the past few years, how he had decided to seek a mate because life was getting too heavy to carry alone, Catherine just nodded with quiet understanding. The storm began to subside in the early hours of the morning. The wind was still blowing, but with less fury, and the rain changed from violent beat to constant peal. Thomas stoked the fire once more, making sure it lasted until dawn, then sat down next to Catherine again. She was staring at the flames, her distant eyes as if she were seeing something beyond the fireplace. Thomas realized that there was a sadness in Catherine that she had carefully hidden, a pain that explained why she had responded to a stranger's newspaper ad instead of finding someone closer to home. Without thinking too much, Thomas reached out and lightly touched her arm. Catherine turned to look at him, surprised by the contact, but she didn't move away. For a moment their eyes met in the firelight, and Thomas saw something open up in her face, a vulnerability she rarely allowed to appear. Catherine covered his hand with her own, a simple gesture that sealed something between them. It wasn't passion or romance in the traditional sense. It was mutual recognition, the understanding that two lonely people had found someone who understood the weight of life in those difficult lands. When they finally separated to go to sleep, it was with the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The storm had washed away more than just the dust from the property. It had also cleared the last resistance between two weary hearts that were learning that sometimes love doesn't come as we expect, but exactly as we need it. Trouble came 3 weeks after the storm, in the form of 5 men on horseback who appeared on the horizon as dark dots against the morning sky. Thomas saw them first, was checking the fence of the south pasture, when he noticed the cloud of dust approaching the property with deliberate speed. It wasn't the dust kicked up by ordinary travelers. It was the mark of men who rode with a specific purpose. He quickly returned to the house, found Catherine in the kitchen preparing dough for bread. He explained what he had seen, suggested that she stay indoors while he found out what the visitors wanted. Catherine dried her hands on her apron, looked through the window in the direction he was pointing, then headed for her room without comment. When he returned, he brought with him a Winchester that Thomas did not know he owned. The weapon was well cared for. The metal glistened with freshly applied oil, and the way Catherine held it betrayed intimate familiarity with its weight and functioning. She positioned herself near the front window, where she could see the visitors approaching, but would remain partially hidden. Thomas stepped out onto the porch with his own rifle, unaimed but visible enough to make it clear that the property had defenses. The 5 men approached slowly, stopped near the gate without dismounting. What appeared to be the leader, a thin man with a black hat and scar that cut his left cheek, studied the house and facilities with eyes they valued more than they admired. The man with the scar identified himself as Jeremiah Cole, said he represented interests that wanted to buy Thomas's property. He spoke about the development of the region, about the railroad that would arrive in the coming years, about opportunities that intelligent men did not let pass. His voice had an oily quality that made every word suspect. Thomas replied that his property was not for sale, that he had built everything with his own hands and planned to die on that land. Cole smiled an expression that did not reach his eyes, commented that sometimes circumstances changed people's intentions, that accidents happened frequently in that isolated region. The threat was clear in Cole's words, masked by polite language, but undeniable in its intent. Thomas felt muscles tense in his shoulders. He knew that kind of man, the kind who took what he wanted when he couldn't afford it, the type who used fear as a bargaining chip. Cole mentioned that he knew about the woman who had recently arrived, noted that it would be a shame if something happened to her as well. His men laughed softly, an unpleasant sound that echoed in the warm morning air. Thomas clenched his fist around his rifle, calculated how many shots he would have before they needed to reload. That's when Catherine appeared on the balcony. He said nothing, just emerged from the house with his Winchester in his hand, positioned himself next to Thomas with an upright posture and eyes fixed on the intruders. His presence immediately changed the dynamics of the meeting. Cole and his men saw not a frail woman in need of protection, but a person who was armed and clearly competent in the use of her weapon. Catherine studied each of the 5 men with meticulous attention, memorized faces, evaluated horses and equipment, identified who would be the most dangerous shooter in the group. Her analysis was muted but obvious. She was preparing for a fight that could start at any moment. Cole tried to maintain his condescending tone, commenting on how beautiful it was to see such a close-knit couple, but his confidence had noticeably diminished. Catherine's presence complicated his plans. 2 competent snipers in a defensive position were very different from a lone man who could be intimidated. Thomas took advantage of the change of atmosphere to make his own position clear. He said that Cole and his men had 10 seconds to leave their property before he considered their presence a hostile invasion. His voice was calm, but there was steel in every word, the promise of controlled violence that men like Cole immediately recognized. Catherine remained silent, but her gun moved slightly, now pointed in the general direction of the intruders. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Cole noticed it. His eyes narrowed as he reassessed the situation, calculating probabilities of success versus potential risks. After a tense moment that seemed to last much longer than it actually did, Cole signaled for his men to retreat. He commented that they would come back another day to continue the conversation, that Thomas should consider the offer more carefully. His words were another kind of threat, the promise that it was not over. The five men walked away slowly, unhurriedly, demonstrating that they were not fleeing but only choosing to postpone the confrontation. Thomas and Catherine remained on the porch until the intruders completely disappeared over the horizon, their silhouettes dissolving in the rippling heat that distorted the distant landscape. Only then did Catherine put down her gun, but she didn't put it away. He commented that Cole would come back, probably with more men, definitely with more violence. Their assessment was practical, without fear but also without illusions about the seriousness of the threat they had faced. Thomas agreed with the analysis, acknowledging that they would need to prepare for a conflict that was just beginning. But for the first time since he had seen the men approaching, he did not feel alone in the face of the problem. Catherine wasn't just an additional presence in their home, she was a genuine partner, someone who would share both the dangers and the responsibilities of protecting what they had built together. In the following days, they prepared the property for a possible attack. They reinforced the windows, positioned ammunition in strategic locations, developed plans for different confrontation scenarios. Catherine demonstrated tactical knowledge that surprised Thomas, suggested modifications to the home defense that he had not considered. They worked side by side with shared purpose, their actions coordinated by the mutual need for survival. The external threat had welded something between them that months of peaceful coexistence might not have been able to do. Facing danger together had created a trust that transcended romantic words or gestures. A week after Cole's visit, Thomas woke up before dawn to find Catherine already awake, sitting by the kitchen window with her Winchester on her lap. She was watching the road, vigilant even during the quietest hours of the morning. When he joined her, Catherine remarked that she had heard horses during the night, distant but moving in the direction of her property. They spent the next few hours on silent alert, prepared for an attack that never came. When the sun rose completely, it revealed an ordinary morning with no signs of threat or imminent danger, but the shared vigil had created another layer of intimacy between them, the absolute trust that each would protect the other. 2 months passed without further visits from Cole or his men. Thomas began to hope that perhaps they had given up, finding easier targets on other properties in the area. But Catherine kept up her vigilance, kept checking guns regularly, kept on the lookout for danger signs that others might ignore. It was during one of these mornings of apparent calm that Thomas realized something had definitely changed between them. Catherine was no longer the unknown visitor who had stepped out of the wagon months earlier. She was their partner, their companion in all aspects of the life they had built together. They shared work, responsibilities, fears, and hopes with a naturalness that seemed to exist for years. The next night, after a particularly difficult day repairing damage caused by a new storm, Thomas found the courage to verbalize what he had been feeling for weeks. He told Catherine that he could no longer imagine his life without her, that she had become essential not only to his survival, but to his happiness. Catherine listened to his words with the same concentrated attention she devoted to everything else, then replied with characteristic simplicity that she felt the same. There were no dramatic declarations or grandiose promises, only the mutual recognition that two lonely people had found completeness in each other. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Catherine did not retire to the smaller room. They stayed together in the house that now belonged to both of them, building an intimacy based on mutual respect, shared competence, and the deep understanding that true love sometimes comes not as we expect, but exactly as we need it. Thomas had asked for a frail bride who needed his protection. What he received was a strong woman who became his equal, his partner, his companion in the hardships and joys of a life built on hard work in the arid lands of the West. And he found that it was infinitely better than anything he had imagined asking for. If this story of courage and survival has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West. Thomas and Catherine taught us that sometimes love comes not as we expect, but exactly as we need it, and there are many more stories like this waiting for you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming journeys through the arid lands where men and women have forged their destinies with blood, sweat, and determination.